Well, welcome everyone. We are thrilled to have you join us for this TEC Canada Q&A on the economic reality of U.S. tariffs. My name is Colten Esser, and I am the manager of strategy and research here at TEC. And today I'm very excited to welcome our guest, Charles St-Arnaud, Chief Economist at Alberta Central. Charles has more than 20 years of experience as an economist in the public and private sector, both in Canada and internationally. Before joining Alberta Central, he was Senior Investment Strategist at Lombard Odier Investment Manager in London, England, advising investors and portfolio managers on global financial markets. Before that, he was a Senior Economist and FX Strategist at Nomura International in New York City and London. Charles was at the Department of Finance in Ottawa during the global financial crisis, where he advised senior officials on economic policy to respond to the crisis. He also worked for the Bank of Canada and Morgan Stanley. He is a regular contributor to the Financial Post, Globe and Mail, BNN Bloomberg, CBC Radio Canada, and Calgary Herald. So with that, welcome again, Charles, and thank you so much for chatting with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. All right, let's kick things off. So we're going to be talking about tariffs, but on a wider scale, also this evolving trade relationship that we're seeing Canada enter with the U.S. So can you give us a little bit of a kind of the state of the union? Where are we at with tariffs? What has evolved? And maybe what are those most immediate risks that we're seeing?
Yeah. Well, I think in the state of where we are, I think it's important to say that we're on March 19. And, and well, we have a little bit of a reprieve until early April on many of the tariffs that have been put. We know that 2 weeks ago, Donald Trump decided that everything that is compliant with the USMCA would be tariffs free and all that. So we have a bit of a reprieve, but there's still a lot of threat looming there. There's a lot of uncertainty in terms of what is waiting for us on April 2nd. And I think it's important to look in terms of, and I think it's something that needs to be, it's important to take a bit of step back and look at why are we being faced with tariffs? What is happening? What change are we seeing in the U.S.? What are the motivation for Donald Trump for the tariffs? And I think we need to see it in some ways in kind of 4 or 5 different, I call it that 4 different versions of Trump. So we have what I call the transactional Trump, which is, I would call it kind of Trump 1.0. You use tariff as a stake. You need to extract something from someone. You threaten tariffs so that that person change their views or their position, so that they don't get a tariff. So that's kind of what we saw in his first term. And that's kind of how Trump has been seen since his election.
Yeah.
Until recently. But there's more dimension in what I would call Trump 2.0. The other dimension is what I would call the isolationist Trump. There is a bigger desire now for the U.S. to withdraw from some of the but the kind of their global role that they've had over the past 70 years or so, since almost the end of of World War II, is that if you need us to be involved in something that matters to you, if you need our protection or our security umbrella, you will need to either pay for it or provide favors for it. And that's one of the reasons for the tariffs. And we've heard it, like for Canada, for example, the fact that we're seen as reliant on the U.S. for our own defense is seen by the Trump administration as, well, it cost us something, so pay for it. And they view the tariffs as one of those reasons. The same can be said for Ukraine and other part of the world where, hey, if you need a protection, yeah, you're gonna pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's kind of the second step or second Trump, I would say. Then the other part is another version is what I would call the imperialist Trump. Is it's using tariff to access either resources or territory. And that's where the 51st state, which started as a bad joke, or that's actually what most Canadians saw it, is becoming more and more serious, is that if you tariff the country to and into submission, they're forced to join. And that's part of sort of the reason, if you look at it more broadly, is that that's why he says, well, I don't need Canada. Oh yeah, if Canada doesn't exist, or it's now a phrase state, there's no Canada to be needed. That's also where Greenland comes into effect, where the idea of getting Greenland is to get access to the resource. Also, the proposed deal that we had a couple of weeks ago with Ukraine with the access to minerals was also that. So there's a lot of trying to get access to new territory, trying to get new resources, and using tariffs to coerce the other side into that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And so what do you, I'm not going to ask you to necessarily put yourself inside of Trump's head, but if that's possible, but which Trump do you think that we're talking to right now as we take a look at, or at least try to build an outlook for the likelihood of tariffs and what that would look like?
Yeah, I think we also need to consider one last Trump, what I call the industrialist Trump, which is how do you use tariff to bring back manufacturing and investment in the U.S. I think we're talking to all four versions of Trump at the moment.
Yeah.
Is that, yeah, if tariffs give me something positive and that's transactional, sure. If it gives me better access to your resource, great. If it brings back investment in my country, great. I think he's playing, I don't think it's a coherent view of what his ultimate aim is. He just knows that by pushing on 4 different front, one of them is going to be a good win. And I think that, or if not all. So he's really trying on all front. And he knows, in the case of Canada, we are quite dependent on the U.S. About 25% of our GDP is exported to the U.S. So he knows that he can create a lot of pain and extract a lot of concession by putting tariffs on either 4 of them.
So when we talk about a lot of pain that can be put on to Canada within this trade relationship, could you maybe paint us a little bit of a picture of what we're actually facing here? And I know, once again, we don't have exact clarity on what's actually going to pan out on April 2nd. But what might be some of the economic scenarios we're facing? Perhaps you have some industry-specific or sector-specific nuances you could share. What are we really looking at here?
Yeah. Well, we're already seeing the pain. Even without tariffs, the uncertainty of what is facing us is already having an impact. We're already seeing businesses kind of putting a hold on hiring, on investment. We're hearing some companies that are reconsidering investing in Canada altogether, and maybe even shifting. Like, I can imagine someone who wants to build a new factory in Canada is probably rethinking if it's going to be built in Canada, or you should be just maybe going for a less profitable option and go across the border in the US. So already that uncertainty is already creating a lot of the environment for Trump to create some wins and bring that investment back in the US. So we're already seeing that. So that's kind of in some ways the mild or the milder version, even though at some point the uncertainty is really going to be too big and create too much loss. Because even at least tariffs, you may have some certainty, you know what you're facing, and then you can take a decision. So the uncertainty might be actually worse in the long run. But then the question is, what kind of tariffs are we facing? And that, I think, it's also the other uncertainty that we have, is that the magnitude of the tariff, like we've heard from February 1st, it was 25% on every import from Canada, except from 10% on energy. Now there's difference because CUSMA is not included. But then on April 2nd, we're getting what do you call reciprocal tariffs, where they will come up with tariff rates for almost every country in the world that will depend on what they don't like with us in some ways. So in Canada, there will be complaint in terms of supply management. There'll be complaint because of our GST. They might be complained because of whatever regulation that we have on some sectors. We've heard Trump complaining that apparently our financial sector doesn't allow U.S. bank to bank here. That's another issue because they were all active here until the financial crisis. They left because of other issues. But but yeah, so he will want to solve all those irritants, as I would call them, to put them mildly, through tariffs. And we don't know, is it going to be the same 25-10? Is it going to be 35%? Is it going to be it's in a wait and see. But it comes in different ways. We know we eventually have the tariffs on steel and aluminum right now that are already affecting especially Ontario and Quebec. Yeah. So that's the uncertainty, is that we don't know what tariffs are we facing in the long run. We don't know also how long are they going to be. If we're lucky and it's actually and I'm wrong and we have a Trump 1.0 and it's only kind of a negotiation tactic and we can get a quick deal within a couple of months and it goes, then the impact is not too bad. But I have a feeling the tariffs are probably there for a much longer period than we can imagine. So when we start thinking of economic impact, Bank of Canada had a great estimate on that, both in the monetary policy report in January, but also in a speech by the governor maybe 3 weeks ago. Basically, when you look at the estimates, if you have they base it on 25% tariffs on everything, you're going to get a recession in Canada. So you go from, and that means also much higher unemployment. Then is looking at, okay, what does it mean? How big? Well, in Canada, when we look at it, like I said, we export 25% of our GDP goes to the U.S., so that's a big hit. When about a bit more than 2 million jobs depend on trade with the U.S., so it's how much of those jobs get lost because of the tariffs. When we look then regionally, is who's more at risk? Well, Alberta is probably the most exposed to trade with the U.S. We export about 33% of our GDP to the U.S. About 15% of the jobs in Alberta, so that's almost 380,000 jobs in Alberta, depends on trade with the U.S. either directly or indirectly. Where we are lucky is that 85% or so of our trade with the U.S. is energy, which is says, well, in the current plan at a lower rate, so the impact will be lower. Also, you can imagine that energy exports will be less sensitive to price change. So you might not have as much of a decline in output in Alberta than, let's say, manufacturing in Ontario, and also less job losses. Ontario, that might be where we see the brunt of the hit, because Ontario exports about 25% of its GDP to the U.S., but it's mainly manufacturing. So if we take the configuration of 25% tariffs on everything that's not energy, that's a much higher tariff rate than what Alberta has. There's also, even though the share of the workforce that is linked to the U.S. is smaller, it's still 1 million workers in Ontario that are exposed to trade with the U.S. And manufacturing is much more price sensitive than energy. So if with tariffs, the decline in input or in output and GDP will be bigger in Ontario in proportion, like in percentage size. So the job losses are likely to be also bigger in places like Ontario or Quebec, which are more linked to the manufacturing sector.
Yeah, so I was actually going to ask you a brief follow-up on that around, what's the Quebec story when we're looking at this? Knowing that Quebec has had some turbulence too, let's say over the last year, there's been turbulence in a lot of places, but, Quebec specifically, what's the outlook in terms of, this tariff situation?
It's very similar to Ontario. They're a bit less exposed because Quebec doesn't have that, is not part of that whole supply chain on the motor vehicle side of the equation, but they're still very reliant on the manufacturing side and exporting to the U.S., but just at a lesser extent. So if we were to rank who's the most exposed to the U.S. trade, it's Alberta, New Brunswick, but that's because they export a lot of energy products, Ontario, and then Quebec. But then if we readjust for the fact that energy is lower, then it's really Ontario, Quebec are the most exposed to the trade. What's interesting is when we look at BC trade is a bit more linked geographically because of their location. They have a greater proportion going to Asia, which in some ways help them having a bit more diversification than the rest of the country. So they're still negatively affected, but much less than the rest of the country.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you for painting that picture a little bit, even if it's not the prettiest picture and the one that we want to see. It certainly helps to be able to take a bit of a barometer across Canada and understand what some of those impacts could be. I'm going to shift gears slightly, and what I want to ask you is a little bit about the internal state of Canada. Right now, we have a lot of pushes that we're seeing internally. A lot of things being thrown around about reducing interprovincial trade barriers. This sort of made in Canada or shop local type pushes in consumption. But really what I want to ask is, we've also had discussions about this longer term trend about Canada's steadily plateauing or falling productivity, depending on what measure you want to look at. This idea of competitiveness, our internal business conditions. Where are we sitting in terms of, the opportunity or the risk that faces us to move the needle on some of these elements?
Yeah. Well, I think in some ways, the existential risk coming from trade, like the whole kind of all the tariffs and what will happen is in some ways in a positive, and it's kind of pushing the politics of towards improving our own fate. We see there's a lot of impetus to open up more of our border, and it's important, especially like it's not going to compensate overnight or maybe even never our trade with the US, but it will help. One of like having that broader or more open internal economy will be important, because right now we're already a small country. We're 41 million Canadian, so it's relatively small when we think that the US is almost 400 million. So it's much harder in Canada for a small business to scale up because we don't have the internal market. But if on top of that you include that you have trade barriers, which basically your market might not be 41 million. It might be, well, you're confined to Alberta and it's 5 million people, right? So it's much harder to scale up. And if you cannot scale up, it's much harder for you to compete in the global scale. That's why in the US it's much easier. When you're a small business, you can grow because you have access to 40 million, 400 million customers. So that's important. So hopefully what's going on with trade and all the uncertainty is giving a lot of push and a lot of desire for all the actors to actually actively look into those interprovincial trade barrier. It's not going to be our savior, but it's going to help. And it's going to help also with our productivity at the same time, because then you reduce a lot of the red tape and regulation that prevent that scaling up or prevent taking advantage of some economies of scale. So that's important. Also, hopefully, and that's where, with the threat of tariffs and with tariffs being put in place, that's where also the government needs to look into, is that we need to use that opportunity to look at how can we actually push better policies to make Canada more competitive, more productive. It is the time, and if there's a place to change government policy in the coming years, it should be then, and especially if we have to create more fiscal support for the economy, it should be directed with an aim of, can we restructure our economy? Can we improve our economy? And that's where it should be. It's very important that any help package from the government needs to be thought very differently than what we had during COVID. Because in COVID, we knew it was a shutdown and it was a stop and go. You drop activity and then it snaps back. With tariffs, activity is going to come down. It might never come up. Even if tariffs are removed, the production that has been moved elsewhere is not going to come back overnight, or may never come back. So that's where it's important that when you do your support package, you keep that in mind, that those who you're supporting might need help permanently. So it's more, how do you reorient the resource that has been kind of liberated because, or kind of let loose because of bankruptcies or production has been put away, how can you reorient into productive means?
Mm-hmm.
So obviously improving business investment and all those kind of things that will be more longer term rather than just, there will be some income support measures for workers and all that, but they need to be more thought in terms of temporary support until they can be redirected to new use.
Yeah, excellent. Couple components in there that I want to touch on, and the first is, so we've talked a little bit about this opportunity that we have within interprovincial trade and reducing those barriers, and and I love your comparison of the markets there, right? Looking at the 40 million versus 400 million. But that 40 million might not actually be your market, right? Effectively, if you've got these trade barriers that are preventing you. And I know we had a conversation earlier as well where that actually explains a lot of that path of least resistance as to how many markets have become so reliant on the U.S. market, because it gives you access sometimes in an easier way than sort of an east-west environment. But another piece that's going around a lot in this dialogue is around I'm going to use the term diversifying markets.
Mm-hmm.
And really what I mean by this is the pursuit of trade partners, other international trade partners outside of the States, which, we've seen some recent government actions, that we're starting to try and get some early, at least on the government side, some early interactions to set that up. But I'm really curious, do you see the opportunity in interprovincial trade to be enough to really help support Canada's economy? Is it essential for us to be going to international trade partners? What does that balance look like?
Yeah, well, I think it's it's not an either or.
Yes.
I think we need to have both,
Mm-hmm.
because then, hey, if both are successful, you have two wins.
Yes.
So it's and both are linked at the same time. Is that by having greater interprovincial trade, you can help to transport your goods or to other coasts or to be exported. The issue I have is that it's not going to be overnight.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, do we have the infrastructure to shift a meaningful amount of our exports to beyond North America? We can just think about oil. Right? We barely have the capacity to send oil to the West Coast. For manufacturers, do we have the port capacity, whether it's in Montreal or Vancouver, to have enough boats to load those goods, or just railways? Because a manufacturer in Ontario that needs to ship to Asia will need to ship his goods to the West Coast. So do we have the infrastructure capacity to accommodate that diversification? And I think that's the other issue that we have, is that it's going to be a long game. But it might also be in some ways the wake-up call that we needed in Canada to realize that, yes, the attractiveness, because, well, 10 years ago, nobody would have questioned you if you were orienting at your trade to the U.S. Again, you have 400 million very hungry customers that are happy to buy what you're producing. Are you going to put the effort and the money to create infrastructure to ship more elsewhere when you already have a market that is consuming what you need? Yes, you could have more and more growth, but at the time, probably the cost was not necessarily justifying all the benefits. But now we're realizing that, yeah, we should have. But there's a different context now.
And not necessarily in favor of voters either, which, as much as we don't want to admit, certainly plays a role in government investment and decision making on that front.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, you can think, Nick, I give as an example. I'm not sure if it's that might cost, but would voters be happy to spend, let's say, $50 billion to build a new railroad between the prairies and the Pacific in crossing the Rockies? Especially considering the recent experience with TMX, which was way over budget, way over deadline. We don't know, and you can imagine that would probably have been this discussion. It's like, well, probably a waste of money.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But now, in hindsight, yeah, no, it would have been needed. But at the time, it might have been seen as a waste of money.
Yeah, excellent. There's another piece you mentioned, and this was around monetary policy. particularly in the forms of government support or programs. I'm curious, really, and we're not going to drag too much into sort of the political realm here.
Yeah.
But we're facing different philosophies in terms of the role of the government in intervening this. And so I'd be curious from an economic standpoint, what do you see as being, sort of valuable opportunities for that, for that monetary policy to be directed? How much of it is a standoff and try and, reduce barriers to attract investment? What is kind of the outlook on that look like?
Monetary policy would be a very complicated, complicated act on its own.
Yeah.
Because you have to balance two different pool on inflation. Like tariffs will have two different impact on inflation. You have kind of what we would expect, like more normal. Like, okay, tariffs are negative for growth or negative for export, negative for growth, increase unemployment. So that will be deflationary. Yeah, in that case, Bank of Canada cut rates, and it's pretty standard monetary policy as we used to. But on the flip side, tariffs increase cost, increase friction. We've seen maybe there'll be more depreciation in the Canadian dollar. That will be inflationary. So how does the Bank of Canada balance those two? And we've seen it with COVID. When inflation gets out of hand, it's very costly for businesses and households. So, and I'm sure the Bank of Canada has a bit of a PTSD about inflation. So they might be less aggressive in cutting rates and thinking about the issues of inflation. Especially, we got inflation number this week, and we've seen that inflation has been creeping higher, even pre-tariff. And that's in the case of if there's no retaliation on tariffs by Canada, because that's also the other part, is that as much as it makes us feel good to retaliate, and you feel like, yes, we can deal with it, we kind of give some, we can also slap. Yeah, we can also get back. The problem is that we need to be careful not to create more damage at home than we actually want to make, because the counter tariffs increase costs here in Canada. So right now, at the moment, it's minimal. It's not too bad, but it comes a time where you're starting to put tariffs, and then it feeds into higher costs for businesses. That hits higher inflation, and the Bank of Canada sees those higher inflation. And we have to remember, the Bank of Canada's mandate is simply to keep inflation between 1% and 3%. They do not have, like the Fed, a dual mandate where they need to seek full employment. So by their mandate, they will need to side on tackling inflation. So that's that's what makes their life a bit more complicated. And to come back to the retaliation, we also have to keep in mind that we are minuscule compared to the U.S. I was saying we export 25% of our GDP to the U.S. The U.S. export the equivalent of 4% of their GDP to Canada. So we need to put tons of tariff to get the same amount of impact on their GDP. So that's why we need to be careful. We need to be clever. We need to be targeted. And that's what we're seeing, like target areas where we could maybe make some political gain. But even there, it's not clear it is going to be in the long run what's going to help us. So, and that's where, as economists, we're very much skeptical about the counter tariffs. Is that they end up hurting the economy more. We might be better off being like, shrug it off and like, okay, we're just gonna be better and more competitive and sell elsewhere. It's almost, you need to play the long game. And in retaliation, we saw it also a couple of weeks ago when Doug Ford decided to put export tariffs on electricity. It can backfire very rapidly.
And that's a very valid point. I'm going to take an alternative perspective for a second, because I'd be curious to see how you address this. So in line with that, one of the perspectives that's being talked about, and whether you want to wrap it up into some of the growing patriotism within Canada or not, it's about this idea that, well, Canadians are more resilient because, to your point earlier, this is existential for us. It's an existential threat. So our ability to withstand greater pain, our threshold for that pain is actually higher than the States. So while the impact, we might not be able to, let's say, punch quite as hard as the States would, we can outlast longer and manage that pain longer than the States. So I'd be curious your thoughts, does that resonate with you, or is there something that we're missing in that line of logic?
I think there will be it resonates that we'll probably be more willing to allow pain. The question is, how much pain are we willing to go for before we give up more than we think we should? And that's it. It's also that in all the negotiation, we'll have to think clearly, is that what are we willing to put on the table? What are we willing? And as I've been putting it for a while, is that which sacred cow are we willing to sacrifice to not have tariffs and to please the president down south? And it's something that would have to take into account. But we also have to think that we're economically, there are a lot of risks in Canada where if it lasts too long, if we have too much of a downturn, it could get really ugly rapidly. We are and it's known vulnerabilities.
Yep.
We have a household sector that is extremely leveraged. That job losses could change dramatically the dynamic of, so far with higher interest rate, they managed to refinance their mortgage, more expensively, but they didn't default it. But once you start losing income, that might change it. That could change the dynamic and make the negative dynamic of tariffs more destructive. That's kind of the big, the left tail risk. But it's something that we need to keep in mind, but because it is there and we need to think about. So as much as I think we're more resilient, the problem is that the question is, how much pain are we willing to really sustain before we change our mind?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I want to bring us into a little bit of a conversation around SMEs. So, knowing TEC Canada, our membership of nearly 2,000, CEOs and business leaders. What are some of let me start with one thing in particular, actually, one topic, and this is going to be around, the passing on of increased cost pressures that you could experience from tariffs. So what do you think? We're coming out of this period of, or maybe arguably we're not out of it, right? But this period of high inflation, now we have increased interest rates, and within that inflationary period, we saw the common strategy was to try and pass along some of your increased costs through the form of pricing. What is the outlook on that? Is there capacity to absorb? I mean, right now what we're talking about is layering on recessionary forces, the potential for layoffs, all that environment, which really, creates some restriction on that demand and that capacity or sensitivity for customers to be able to absorb that, and other businesses. So what are your thoughts on the outlook of that type of a strategy? Is that something that SME should still be exploring? I'll leave it with you.
Well, that's where it will be hard for businesses to absorb the higher costs. It's going to be passed at some point. And then the problem is, or the concern is, will household be able to absorb that cost? So, and we saw it during the pandemic, it created a lot of discontent. The difference is we had an economy that was actually growing. We had a low unemployment rate. So you had, on top of the increase in input costs from the supply chain and availability and all that, now you also had increasing wage cost. So you had a double whammy on businesses, which you probably won't have this time. You have the input costs, but if you start to see layoff, you won't have the wage demand are probably going to be a bit more under control.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that household will be there to have the purchasing power to consume. So it might lead, that higher inflation will lead to lower consumption and lower demand. So it's kind of almost a self-fulfilling where, well, my costs are higher, I pass it, nobody's buying. Then I have weaker sales. And
right, and the cycle continues. Yeah. So what would be your thoughts on how businesses should be approaching, let's call it workforce planning? Now, outside of a recommendation, I'm not asking for a recommendation on what they should be doing, but more so, building an understanding of Well, there's still this sensitivity coming out of a post-pandemic era of, it was really hard to find talent during that period. And,
Yeah.
talent was scarce. And arguably, if you look at demographics, we could still be in that state.
Yeah.
So, do you see talent as still being this really high-value commodity? How should businesses kind of think about that going into this potentially a new recessionary period?
I think that's a very interesting question because it's not clear really. And I think it depends a lot on the type of workers you're looking for. If you're looking for someone who's specialized, that person is probably as valuable, if not more valuable now, because if you really need it, you'll want that person. I think it's more at the other end of the spectrum in terms of lower skill. There might be a bit more willingness to, especially if you start to see bigger layoffs, where there will be a bit more supply on that side. And we see it in the data, like job vacancies for skilled workers is still a lot high.
Yeah.
There's still a lot of demand for those who have the skills. And that's going to continue, even in unless you're in an industry that suddenly has a complete recession and nobody wants to hire. But in businesses that will still be active will need those workers. It's really kind of probably more industry specific and area specific, but there will always be demand for those with skills. It's more at the other end of the spectrum. It's not like COVID where suddenly we couldn't find frontline worker. That might be a different issue now. And it's actually something that I've been looking and thinking about, is that in terms of when we look at the labor force and the labor market, the impact of the job losses due to tariffs might be bigger than what we had during COVID, because those who are going to lose their job are mostly in jobs linked to manufacturing or natural resource extraction that make, in average, more money or have higher wages than the general population. So each job losses is a bigger income loss than what we had during COVID per person. The amount of job losses will not match COVID, because I don't think we're going to lose that. It was 2.5 million jobs. But per person or per worker that gets laid off, there'll be more impact. So there's other things to think about as an economist and behind the scene.
Yeah. That's very interesting. So I'm going to ask sort of on another realm of, let's call it investment, is just that. So how should businesses, especially SMEs, be thinking about, capital investment and expenditure? And maybe even if you have a comment, I'd be curious about the role of even technology like AI. Is there a role of AI within this realm of, let's say, filling in either workforce gaps, increasing productivity, helping your business be more competitive or more cost efficient in this new environment?
Yeah. Well, when we look at investment per se in the current environment, the uncertainty is clearly the killer. Why would you, if you don't have the certainty, why would you commit millions of dollars or whatever amount into new machinery, new facilities, or you're not. And that's where actually a lot of the weakness we're seeing right now. And I think that the first part is, you're a manufacturer and you want to build a new production facility. You're looking at Canada, you're looking at the US. If it's a new investment, new production, you're probably putting it into the US right now, because you have the certainty that whatever happened in 6 months, tariffs or no tariffs, I'll still be fine. So that's what we're seeing. Then the question is, the longer the tariffs continues, is what happened to kind of the upgrade and repair, retooling of current production needs. Because right now, like I give an example, you're an auto manufacturer in Southern Ontario. Your machinery has been put in place 20 years ago. You're on the cost of like, well, I should be modernizing, I should be retooling. But in the current environment, you might be waiting, like, okay, yeah, I can use those tools. They're not the most efficient, but I'll use it for a while. But within the next 5 years, I need to do major investment. You're probably, the longer those tariffs are here, the longer that uncertainty, the longer you might be like, you know what? I might not be modernizing my current production in Canada. I will be switching it to the US. So that's where it's hard. That uncertainty really changed a lot of the dynamics. So that's where there'll need to be some certainty for businesses to invest. And we're talking about kind of longer term issues in terms of productivity that have been an issue in Canada. Part of it is lack of business investment. There'll need to be some support to make sure that businesses are willing to invest, especially in an environment where it's uncertain. We might have weaker economic growth. So it's to push that drive to invest we'll need support.
That's the golden ticket. Yeah.
So and that's where it is, and that's hard to go into AI. There will be a need for that. There will be a need for help to, in some ways, because for me AI is not just displacing worker, or it's displacing a different way. You're not going to lay off workers. You're actually allowing or removing kind of more low value added tasks, so they have the time to do higher value added tasks. So in some ways there's a place for that, because you still keep your expertise from the workers that you have, but they can actually do more with their time rather than doing something that, well, an AI can do instead.
Yeah, interesting. And when you mentioned that, it's going to be essential to encourage this or to facilitate this business investment, you can certainly look at that from I'll call it a governmental or a macro scale. But outside of, let's say, sitting and waiting for the government to, facilitate the means for greater business investment, to attract foreign investment, to reduce interprovincial trade barriers, what are some things that leaders of SMEs, it's a big question, but what are some things that they can explore right now that maybe fall within their realm of control to really help move the needle on this and to support the business environment within Canada?
Yeah, well, it's really being part of the discussion. Because especially we're going into an election very quickly, so being vocal in terms of what they would want to see. They are they are better placed than most policymakers to know what's needed in the business communities. So using their platform and the opportunity that they have of being very close to an election to actually make sure that they're being heard and that their views is being taken into account with policies. I think in some ways they're in an interesting situation this way, is that and I think political parties are probably more receptive now, considering what's going on with tariffs, to hear what's going on. We know also there's a lot of there's a bit more urgency into the whole helping with productivity, competitiveness. So there's a bit more receptivity into that, because and that's probably where they can start doing a lot more work.
Yeah, I love that, and that's been an ongoing conversation about how can Canada's small and mid-sized business community really become more involved, both within their local communities, but try and get their voices heard.
I always say the government doesn't know everything. They often are happy to hear what do people think and having some discussion. And often they'll just want to know, is like, how can I be helpful to you?
So what are some of the channels that business leaders could maybe look at in order to get their voices heard? There might be a specific question I'm asking because I don't know, but I'd be curious. Who do you look to engage with to help move the needle or to join the conversation?
That's a good question, because it depends on how you do it. Because for me, as an economist, we do it very differently. So often it's speaking to your local MTs, speaking to if you have trade associations, that's part of their role. They have usually a government relationship person who has those discussions. So it's trying to be engaged. Good old lobbying. But lobbying in some ways, because sometimes it has a bad rap. For me, lobbying is making sure that people know. It can be just writing what you would like to see. And there's right now we see it. I thought on LinkedIn, there's a great campaign by the oil and gas producers saying, "Oh, we need this, and that's often what you need. It could be sectoral, it could be all the business, it could be whoever wants to take the lead, but making sure that the voice is heard, that this is what the small and medium enterprises in Canada would want to see from the next government.
Yeah, I love that. And so whether it's, you taking the lead yourself or to your point, getting involved in maybe some of your local trade industry organizations.
Your local chambers of commerce,
Chambers.
that's often their part of their remits.
Yep. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, those are great ways to start getting your voice heard for sure. So Charles, we're just about at our time here for today. Is there any other final thoughts that you'd like to share, with the SME community that comes from your perspective as an economist?
Yeah, well, I think as much as the outlook is extremely uncertain, and that we have to go for it, is like we don't know what's going to happen, and I wish I could have a crystal ball to know how things are going. I think there's still some positive in all the uncertainty, and all the negative that could happen is that the tariffs and the existential threat that is coming from those tariffs and the potential downturn, it might actually be the kick in the right direction for the Canadian economy, where we actually take seriously some of the long-term challenges that we haven't addressed over the past few decades, whether it's productivity, interprovincial trade, whether it is diversification of our international trade, thinking hard in terms of what do we want for our economy long term, and how do we grow the pie going forward. I think that might be the positive that we'll get out of that, is that it's forcing us to address our issues.
Yeah, I really love that, because I think there is that certain energy that you can feel, almost a tangible energy, and greater unity, greater passion, creativity, and problem solving. These are all very...
And everybody willing to push in the same direction, because everybody's now seeing that we need to do it.
Yes.
So you don't have, I want to do that, and then you have an naysayer, no. Yeah. But it's because everybody's realizing that, that's the goal.
Yes.
We all kind of feel that is a common goal, and we might not all agree on how we're going to reach it, but at least the goal is now a lot more common and more precise than it was just 6 months ago.
Yes. We might not know how to reach it, but we know we've got to reach it. Yeah. Excellent. Well, Charles, that's going to bring us for time today. Thank you so much for once again sharing your perspective. On behalf of our nearly 2,000 members that we have here at TEC Canada that represent Canada's SME community, we really, really appreciate the insight that you've shared. It's truly invaluable. So thank you again.
Thank you for the opportunity.